In today's episode of Encore's Tri-C podcast, we're going to talk with a historian who does something very interesting. He puts history in context. Bob Wido, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Ted.
Your approach to history is, I really applaud it, because you're the 20th century history that you give. You're taking it in blocks of decades, but you're telling us the context of the events is important. And so often, I think when we read about history, we're not put in that place where the history is taking place, and we sort of tend to judge it from our perspective. So Tell me a little bit about your contemporary history or your 20th century history classes.
So I started reading a lot in my retirement, and I started reading a lot about the 1960s, which I think is an absolutely fascinating period of American history. And after I'd read about a dozen books, I thought, I could teach this at Encore. And so I did. I taught a class on the 1960s, and it was very popular because, it's amazing to me. People will come up and say, I lived during the 60s. And it's like, yeah, we all did. This is our history. This is our story, the 1960s. Well, as I was preparing to teach on the 60s, I found that I needed the context of the 60s. So I started to study the 1950s. And I found the 1950s to be every bit as fascinating as the 1960s. Post-World War II, America is doing very well because the whole world has been decimated by the war, and the only people left standing are Americans. So if you need trucks or bulldozers or steam shovels, it all comes from America. So America is building and doing very, very well in the 50s, and then we get into the 60s. Now I'm starting to teach a class on the 1970s, which is also our period of time. So this period of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, I find to be very, very fascinating. I'm really enjoying the study.
Oh my gosh. Well, so the 40s sort of give us context to the 50s
Sure.
and World War II. And most people are at least aware that, right, there was some sort of conflict that was going on.
Big time
in the world. But there's also then the 50s included the Korean conflict,
yes,
and the possibility of communist infiltration into the highest levels of government,
yes,
and the Cold War and the tensions that were. It wasn't all how much is that doggy in the window, and
no, not at all, not at all.
So there was. We tend to think of it as more of a stable decade, but maybe talk a little bit about the changes that we as a culture were facing in the 50s that led then to the more radical things happening in the 60s.
If you think about what our parents experienced in the 40s and the 50s, after World War II is done, it becomes very clear that Stalin would like to take over more and more land. Poland, East Germany, the wall is going to divide Germany in half. 1949, China decides they want to be communist. So, and then you've got
Cuba. Not without struggle.
Not without struggle. Millions of people are murdered in the pogroms of China, and Stalin is just absolutely brutally ruthless. And so then you've got Cuba that becomes communist. So I'm thinking of my parents sitting watching TV or reading the newspaper and saying, oh my gosh, the whole world is going to become communist pretty soon.
What were we over there fighting for? What was it all,
exactly. Now we've got Korea going on. And the reason Korea is going on is because the North is coming into the South. The communists are expanding. Same thing in Vietnam. So this tenors everything in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The whole Cold War idea and McCarthy seeing communists everywhere. And it's a very frightening time. When I grew up in Parma, my next door neighbor had a bomb shelter because he was convinced that we were going to be annihilated by a nuclear attack. And we heard this growing up. If any place is going to get blown up, it's going to be Cleveland because we have so much industry here that's where they're going to be targeting.
Well, there was a tank factory out by the airport.
I mean, so you would think this would be the target. And so everybody sort of held their breath thinking communism is going to take over the world. we're going to live in a bomb shelter. There's going to be a nuclear holocaust. And this flavors everything that goes on.
Kind of a grim outlook. We typically think of the 50s as kind of a carefree time, but it for many people, there was real concerns about what, and then things kind of come to a head with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
The Cuban Missile Crisis was very close to being a hot war. I think Stalin and the leadership of the Soviet Union looked at this young president, John Kennedy, and thought, they tried to invade Cuba with expatriates, and it was a colossal failure. Here's our chance to push the envelope a little bit. We're going to put some missiles in Cuba and see if we can get that through. Eisenhower had been the president. They wouldn't have dared try something like that with Eisenhower, but they thought, Kennedy, we might be able. And they realized that Kennedy had a backbone of steel. He stared them down, and eventually they moved the missiles out of Cuba.
How close did we come? Because there were blockades. And there were people trying to run the blockades.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were very close to a nuclear, if not a nuclear, a hot war where we were exchanging missiles back and forth with each other. It was a very touch and go time.
I bet the people of Florida started building bomb shelters.
I bet so. And, growing up in Parma, I remember there being a Nike site there, which we always thought we saw soldiers over there, but never. That was a missile site that was there where Tri-C is now.
Oh,
matter of fact, my son came home one day and said, "Hey,
the West
Dad."
Campus.
The West Campus, yeah. My son came home and said, "Hey, Dad, I see where they're going to start building shoes in Parma." I said, "What do you mean?" There's a big sign that says Nike site. I'm like, no, wrong kind of Nike, Bob. You can see where he would think that,
I think from somewhere in the recesses of my study of history, that's victory. Nike is victory.
Yeah, I think so.
It's an old Greek.
Yeah, that would be Greek for victory. Yeah,
something like that. So that's where that's coming from.
But I love the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the characters, the inventions that came along. We talk a lot about the advent of television, radio, the computer chip that came along. Just so many things.
Oh, the transistor.
The transistors. We take a whole class in the 1960s class to talk about the cars of the 1960s, and what's some terrific automobiles. And they're so much better today than they were back then, but some terrific cars back in the 60s. The Mustang came out in 64, and everybody loved cars.
When did the Etzel come out?
Oh, that was in the late 50s, I think.
The late 50s.
That was a bit of a disaster.
And named after the fellow's wife, if I'm not mistaken.
Etzel, yeah, I believe so. And it was not tenable. And the Corvette and the T-Bird and just the 60s are terrific. What a great period of time.
Well, and then do you talk at all about the British invasion of music?
Yeah, absolutely. With the Beatles coming over and how popular they were, and you see the picture of the Beatles that our parents were so worried about, and they have a little long hair, but they've got suits and ties and jackets, and it's like if you looked at music today and compared it to them. They say that this is a second British invasion, and the Monkees, the Beatles, all the musicians who came over from England and really made a big impact in our lives. Yeah.
And then what are the factors from the 60s that then influenced the 70s?
Oh, all kinds of stuff. I think that the people in the 50s are ex-military. I think of my father, who served in the Army and served in the Air Force. He was very straight-laced, hardworking. I'm gonna take care of my family. I'm gonna do everything I can because I don't want there to be another war. And the 60s come along, and I think people rebel against that.
And your dad was in World War II.
He was in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And they did they call it Air Force back then, or was it
Army? It was the Army Air Corps. So my dad served in the Army in World War II. And left the Army after the war. He got in at the tail end of it because he was born in 1925, so he was 18 when the war was really going on. But then he went to medical school. on the GI Bill and became a surgeon. And lo and behold, found out that the only people who had served in World War II who were eligible to be drafted into Korea were physicians. And so he got drafted to go to Korea. And he is actually in Guam off the coast of Korea doing medical care. And, he was a patriot. He was a guy who was a wonderful, wonderful man who worked hard, very smart, took care of his family. And I think he saw his boys growing up in the 60s questioning things like Vietnam. And, you think of Archie Bunker, we went to war in World War II. Vietnam's here. It's your turn to go to war. And Mike Stivic is saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to support this war effort. And that was the 60s. That was the 60s.
But you ended up joining the military anyway.
I did.
But in a very unique role.
I was. I went to school to go into the ministry because I felt called into the ministry. But I never felt called to be a pastor. It just didn't resonate with me. I thought maybe I would be a missionary. I thought that I could go to the mission field. And I went to the mission field between my junior and senior year in college. I went up to northern Alaska, and I really didn't like it. And so I graduated from college, and I said, Lord, I feel like you're calling me into the ministry. I don't want to be a pastor. I don't want to be a missionary. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. And so, I got a job working in a steel mill, and I was working next to a guy in this steel factory, and he looked at me one day and said, Bob, you'd make a really good military chaplain.
Wow.
And a light went on, and I thought, I don't know anything about being a military chaplain, but I'm going to learn. So I read 2 different books on being a military chaplain. It was through that period that God seemed to direct me into the military. And so I talked to my dad. I said, if you had your choice between the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, what would you do? And Dad said, if you like hamburger, go into the Army. But if you like steak, go into the Air Force. And so I did. I went into the Air Force. I served for 34 years in uniform as a chaplain, serving as a pastor to the men and women of the United States Air Force. And it was a privilege. It was a wonderful ministry, and I loved it. I really did.
That's got to be a second podcast with you and Diane together to talk about that.
Let's do that.
But in the meantime, I think I asked you how the 60s affected the 70s, and then I didn't really let you answer the question.
Oh, it did. I mean, the 60s affected the 70s in that we were all young in the 60s and enthusiastic and felt like we could change the world. And then the 70s came along, and I think we began to realize that life was not all as good as we thought. We had Watergate, which really undermined the authority of the of the federal government. We had a number of issues like Kent State that went on. My Lai massacre went on that said the military is not really doing what they should be.
These things are coming to light.
Yeah, and I think the 70s were a period of disillusionment for a lot of people. I have a cartoon that I start my 70s class with a lady who has just turned 70, and somebody asks her what she thinks, and she says, my experience is that it was a lot more fun being in my 20s in the 70s than being in the 70s in the 20s. And, I think we can all relate to that. I think that's exactly right.
Absolutely. So at the risk of opening a can of worms, my view I was a young kid when this was going on.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that Nixon was he did win, and it was a bit of a landslide.
It was a huge landslide.
And he had a lot of political capital because he was getting out of Vietnam and he was withdrawing and there were other things that were influencing his, and it doesn't seem like what he did was evil or nasty or whatever. It seems more foolish than anything else to be spying on somebody like that when you didn't need to.
Nixon blew Ford out of the water in the election. He won 49 of the 50 states in the Electoral College. Only Massachusetts went for Ford. And the reason...
Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, McGovern. Excuse me. McGovern.
That's right, McGovern. Excuse me. I'm sorry, McGovern. Anyways, Nixon won by a landslide, and he won because of the whole problem with what had gone on in Vietnam.
LBJ,
the whole situation there. Yeah, and so when he ran again, he won by a landslide. Exactly. Yeah.
Very, very foolish period of history, I guess.
It was. It was a very foolish period of history.
But that sort of ties into.
It does. I mean, and Ford is the president when Nixon leaves, and Ford immediately pardons Nixon, and that cost him the election.
Well, and there was all kinds of inflation issues.
There were huge inflation issues. The whole Tehran thing with Carter was a problem. And so the 70s are a difficult period. I call it a difficult decade because it really is.
Well, for a brief moment, right, we for at least a year, we celebrated the bicentennial and we got nostalgic about things.
Yeah.
And I again, my perspective on this history, which if you have a different one, please share. Carter gave us a little moment of optimism and that things were going to be.
He did. I mean, Carter was probably one of our most intelligent presidents. People don't realize that, but he was a nuclear physicist at the Naval Academy.
I just learned something new.
Yeah, he was a nuclear physicist, very intelligent, worked in submarines, left the military because his father passed away and he went back to be a peanut farmer. So people think a peanut farmer from Georgia, how smart can this guy be? He read 2 books a night. I mean, he was a brilliant person, and also a person of faith and a person of integrity, who thought maybe he could come in and change the world. And I think he got gobbled up in the whole political world. And the energy crisis was going on, and he'd come on TV with a cardigan sweater and tell people to turn the heat down. And he seemed sort of naive, but he was really a very intelligent man.
Right.
Very intelligent.
And somebody that put his faith into action after he left office.
He was probably one of these people who really came into their element after he was done with the election rather than during the election. He served 1 term and then he just got blown out of the water by Reagan. Reagan came along, and I think people were ready for a bit more optimism than Carter was able to give.
Well, and are you preparing a class then on the 80s for us?
No, I think I'm going to try a class on the Cold War. That to me sounds like a fascinating period of because that sort of strings between the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I think that's going to be my next class.
And then you also you have biblical roots in teaching.
I've taught a couple of classes. One, I taught on where the Bible comes from, which I think is a fascinating class. A lot of people don't realize that the Bible was written by over 50 writers over the course of 2,000 years. I mean, it's a remarkable story of how the Bible came to be.
This is the Old Testament,
and Old and New Testaments,
and then the New Testament. And
yes.
We don't know the names of many of these authors. We just know the stories.
We can guess. Whether we got the guess right or not, we don't know. But to me, it's amazing that the 66 books of the Bible tie in so closely together with each other, even though they've been written by different people from different nations at different periods of time, and it all sort of gels together. And I find that to be phenomenal.
It sort of gives us this mosaic of history. Almost.
It sure does. It does. And the other class that I teach that I'm really passionate about is I teach a class called Christianity's Family Tree. And this is about the different denominations in Christendom. We start with the Orthodox Church and a Catholic Church and a Lutheran Church, and it's kind of a combination of church history and theology. And the goal is, what can we learn from each other that will help us to live our lives better? So each class, we end by saying, we've talked about the Episcopalians. What can we learn about from the Episcopalians? It will help us in our spiritual pilgrimage. I really like that class. That's a fun class, an enjoyable class.
At the risk of again opening up a can of worms, did you ever get into the deist movement and the Enlightenment in Europe? And do you go that far?
We do a little bit. We do a little bit, but mainly we keep with the major denominations of Christendom. And we stay away from those who would not be Trinitarians, the Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses. We don't really do too much with them.
Gotcha.
I don't want to make it controversial.
No. It's fascinating history of how these different Protestant denominations came about, and even going back to antiquity, and how right? The Christian church, when the empire split, we sort of got stuck with Roman Catholic, not stuck with, but we divided into Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodox. And
yes. For the first 1,000 years of the Christian church, there were no denominations. And I tell people, if you have a tree in your front yard and it's growing and eventually it branches into two, which one of those branches is the oldest? Well, neither one. Well, that's the way it is in the Christian church. For 1,000 years, there were no denominations until the Eastern Church separated from the Western Church, and we came up with Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and that's kind of the beginning. And that was 500 years before Luther broke from the Catholic Church. So, yeah.
And he really didn't. He more got kicked out than said, I'm going to start a new religion.
He would be appalled to think that there's a church called the Lutheran Church. He really would be. He was excommunicated. He translated the Bible into German, which was a huge thing back then because nobody could read the Bible because it was all in Latin. He translated it into the lingua franca. The printing press was a new invention, so the Bible is now available to be printed and distributed to lots of people. And that starts the Protestant Reformation. Yeah.
Wow.
But, I've worked with a lot of these guys who are Lutheran or Episcopalian or Baptists. I have a good feeling about them. They're good people. They love God. They have a different way of seeing life, but we can learn from each other, and that's okay.
Well, and in the Venn diagram of all the different Protestant religions, there's a lot more overlap than there are
That's
distinctions.
Exactly right. That's exactly, and everybody brings something meaningful to the table. I love the bells and smells of the Anglican Church. I love the structure of the Catholic Church. I love the passion of the Pentecostal Church. They all have something to teach us.
That's awesome. One day you'll write the synthesis for that.
I'm not sure that'll be my job.
Bob, it's been so great to talk with you today. Please come back very soon.
We will. Thanks for having us, Ted. We appreciate that.